Here we are, champions. The final seed of the game. 12 out of 12. End of an era. But don't worry, I'm nowhere near done covering this game. But for the time being, let's focus on the topic at hand, because this seat has a lot of depth, and some absolute units. So for the last time, you know how we do it around here. We're starting with the core champion of the seat, then working our way down alphabetically. And buckle up, buckaroo, because we've got 9 champions, most of them fairly unique. Today we're starting with Arkhan, the neutral evil, dragonborn paladin. If you've been listening in on this series, you know this name has popped up a couple of times. He's the one and only combination of the DPS and tank roles, scaling his damage in a unique way, by increasing the effect of positional formation abilities on him in one of 2 ways, depending on his specialization choice. The first is bulk up, where as long as he is in the frontmost column, all positional formation abilities he's receiving are increased. Or usurped power, where he will receive, at the same increased rate, all positional formation abilities from adjacent champions, as long as he is not receiving them. So if you're using Arkhan as your DPS, you will ideally want him to have all other supports in the formation to have positional formation abilities. Then determine if he can receive them all while being in the frontmost column, or set it up where he is not receiving any of them, and rather those that are adjacent to him are, so he can usurp them. Remember, there is a gear slot tied to this, so by scaling bulk/usurp, you are effectively increasing all positional formation abilities he is receiving, hence why positionals are so important. He also increases his damage with Rising Anger, where he increases the damage of all evil champions for each enemy attacking him and/or each enraged stack, as well as Rage of the Dragonborn, where if 6+ enemies are attacking Arkhan, his base attack deals 5 times damage and cleaves, and at 16+ enemies attacking him, his attack becomes a massive flame AoE for 25 times damage. Enraged stacks also count as enemies. He does have a minor synergy with one of his affiliations, the Dark Order synergy, where he attacks 0.5 seconds faster for each slotted member. But as I have explained in the past, this affiliation isn't the greatest for Arkhan, as it involves Torogar and Krull, who are good supports in their own right. But neither of them offer a positional formation ability for Arkhan to scale with his bulk/usurp, so they're not the greatest for him. His ultimate attack summons his gnarly Manticore Chango to deal damage to an enemy and those around it. For a core DPS champion, who can also serve as a tank, he's a pretty solid champion, and his scaling isn't bad. I'd put him in a low B. He's got better scaling than a lot of DPS champions out there, but he doesn't quite reach the heights others can. Second in line is Azaka, the lawful neutral human fighter. And another case of, if you've been paying attention, this name has definitely come up before. She's our last evergreen champion, and you're really only ever going to be using her for one thing: gold farming. In fact, with her and her alone, you unlock a very particular form of gold find widely known as Azaka farming. This is due to her ultimate attack, which summons 2 tigers to attack enemies, causing them to drop gold as if they were killed. This is important because it means you can push to your wall, where you are otherwise not able to kill enemies, throw in all of your potential gold find champions, and farm up at a level you otherwise wouldn't be killing and earning. To set up an Azaka farm, you will ideally want 1 enemy left over from a boss area. Some important members to an Azaka farm are Baloth, Beetle and Grim, and Donner, as they all have a sticky debuff that makes enemies drop more gold, and then can be swapped to a static gold find buffer. Havilar is also very useful with her ultimate to make them completely stop in their tracks, so that last remaining enemy is not hitting your formation, which she can also then be swapped. Then you want to fill every slot in your formation with gold champions and use her ultimate to make that sweet, sweet gold. A lot of people use a freely setup, which involves slotting freely and making his spec lawful, and using all of the lawful gold finders he can, then filling the rest with other lawfuls to all proc his gold find lucky break on as many champions as possible. Something like this. I personally do not do this as it requires a lot of investment in freely to be good. Which, don't get me wrong, he's a great champion to invest in if you use him with your DPS. but I think there are currently enough other gold finders out there. For example, let me break down what would be a Freely formation versus my current gold formation, with all of my personal numbers. Warning, a bit of math ahead. And remember, this is based on my personal item levels. And all of these champions are roughly in the same boat, as far as item levels and feats go. With Freely, I'm able to slot a few other gold finders like Drizzt, Omen, Kroll, Stokey, and Azaka herself. And now Quillic as well since his seasonal change. As they are all lawful, and we're going lawful because Azaka is lawful and we absolutely need her for an Azaka farm, don't we? So now we fill the rest with other lawfuls, using Nrak to buff everyone with a wisdom of 14 or higher, as he's also lawful. Now for the sake of this, I'm going to calculate it without Kroll, because he relies on virulent plagues to stack much higher and that doesn't always happen, but any gold find formation should be using him, so he'll cancel himself out in both formations anyway. So in my case, Freely's Lucky Break Requisition with feats is a multiplicative 658.8% increase for each debuff. And we're going for 10 with a full slotted roster of lawfuls, which comes to 1.5 E8%, because each member can only apply it once and then refresh it. And this is assuming every single member happens to have it up when we proc Azaka's ult. Omen's contractual obligations is 3.85 E5%, Drizzt's bounty is 959.4%, Azaka herself also gives 1.23 E5%, Quillic gives 1.53 E4%, Stokey with 5 stacks of Golden Palm on a single target is 3.33 E5%. That comes to a total of 3.56 E19% times Kroll gold find increase. Let's compare this to my personal gold find formation. Merylwyn at 1.75 E8%, Omen for the same at 3.85 E5%, Jarlaxle at 4.65 E5%, Valentine at 4.63 E5%, Egbert at 1.61 E6%, Eliwick at 1.57 E5%, and she can scale higher with more gem draws, this was a low draw. Rust at 2.5 E6%, and Azaka still at 1.23 E5%. This comes to a total of 1.1 E32% times Kroll. Now of course you can mix and match for Freely, like taking in the enormous gold find of Merylwyn over Drizzt, and replacing Stokey with Jarlaxle, slotting Rust over Dragonbait, but doing that starts to dilute Freely's debuff, because you are replacing lawfuls with non-lawfuls. In the example I just gave, with Merylwyn, Jarlaxle, and Rust in the formation instead with Freely, we'd be looking at a potential 7.92 E26%. Better, but not quite reaching what I otherwise can do. Again, this is vastly different if you choose to bump up Freely's item levels, but that could be said about anyone. With competitors like Gazrick and Egbert sharing his seat, he's got some stiff competition now. Anyway, let's quickly wrap up the rest of Azaka, as you'll never use her for anything else. She serves the DPS role as she shifts between her human form and her werewolf form, dealing more damage as a werewolf, but not enough to be competitive. And while she's in werewolf form, she will reduce her gold find buff, Guiding Hand. She also serves as a support with Adept Traveler, increasing the damage of your formation if they are in an exterior location by a small amount. Her specialization choice is between being human more or werewolf more. Take Resist the Curse, always. Her ultimate cannot drop gold off of enemies without it, and you never want to use her as your DPS anyway. Honestly, as a DPS and support, she's in like the D to F tier range, but her gold find is Omega S tier. So much so, I'm going to do something I don't usually do. Even after averaging her out, that still leaves her in a low S tier for me, because the best way to farm gold in the game completely relies on her existing. Even if that's her only purpose, it's so clutch that getting Azaka, in my opinion, should be most new players' early game goal. Even if you don't have a full roster to set up a perfect Azaka farm, getting to your wall and swapping in all the gold find you do have, and activating her ult is still very likely to get you the best amount of gold you can possibly get. Now we've got the newcomer Daub, a chaotic good half-orc bard, who serves as a gold find and support. He's a strange example of being Frankenstein from other champion formation abilities, but in a way that actually works quite well. To start, he has Traveling Entertainer, where he works like Polton in Seed 4, and that he increases the damage of champions not adjacent to him, but increases your gold find for each champion he is adjacent to with busking. So you want him adjacent to as many champions as possible, while not being adjacent to your DPS. He also takes from Grama, in that his ultimate will summon a wall that lasts for 20 seconds, but it will also deal damage and increase the damage of evil champions by 1000%. Now if that were it, he'd be quite average, but we're not done yet. He also has Offshore Accounting, where at the transition to each new area, there is a chance that Dob will run off with your gold and throwing it in a lake, because reasons. But don't worry, your gold isn't actually gone. What does happen is that he gains deposit stacks equal to the exponent of that thrown away gold, which will scale up both Traveling Entertainer and busking. The number of deposit stacks is capped at 25 times the highest area completed in the current adventure. His specialization choice is between different means of increasing Traveling Entertainer, all of which increase with his affiliation, Oxventurers Guild members slotted in your formation, and then a choice between increasing it based on magical-based attacking champions, champions with a charisma of 17 or higher, champions with a dexterity of 17 or higher, or increasing it based on how many unique races are slotted. Simply take the one that your DPS formation will benefit from the most. His scaling is actually quite good. His problem is that he shares C12 with Azaka, so they can't be used in tandem for an Azaka farm, but we can't hold that against his kit. He also is available for every patron with great ability scores, so his availability is really on point. And if you care to pair them, he's also Nrackable, which really boosts his scaling. A great example of just a rock-solid, A+ champion who doesn't quite get into S, but he holds his head up high. Next up is Melf, the neutral good elf fighter/wizard, who serves as speed and support. His support comes in the form of Melf's adaptive support spell. It starts by only increasing the damage of adjacent champions, but certain factors will increase its effectiveness. If another elf is slotted in your formation, it will be increased by 50%, and the range is increased by 2 slots if Melf is not in the front or backmost columns, and will also be increased by 25% for each unique race slotted. And he will also increase its effect by 100% on the non-dominant gender in the formation, and yet another 100% each slot away from Melf the champion is. So, to recap, for maximum effectiveness, you want at least one other elf slotted. Have Melf in one of the middle columns, have your DPS the non-dominant gender, while being 3 slots away from Melf, while having as many unique races slotted as possible. But even after all of that, it's a pretty average buff. He also debuffs enemies with Melf's Righteous Determination, where he has a 50% chance to mark a spawned enemy, deeming them evil. Those who are marked will take more damage from ultimate attacks. The speed comes from Melf's Speedy Supplement, where every 50 areas he will switch between 3 potential buffs. First, spawning additional enemies when one spawns. Second, increasing the spawn speed of enemies. Or third, increasing the quest reward completion count. Basically, he rotates between being a lesser version of Tatiana, Whittle, and Human, even though he came out before any of them. His specializations are a choice between increasing the buffing potential of either his adaptive support, speedy supplement, or righteous determination, and his ultimate summons 6 little meteors that rotate around him and explode in AoE bud damage when he attacks. He's pretty useful for his speed mechanic, and offers at least average support while doing so. I think his overall utility bumps him somewhere between high B and low A, pushing just into low A, especially if you are newer. His speed mechanic is a lot more noticeable early on when he's not overshadowed by other item-leveled speed champions. Moving on now, we got Nerys, the lawful good human cleric. While I love her overall design, she's the only real oof we've got in this seat. She summons a spiritual weapon, which she eventually has hover over the highest DPS in the formation to attack when they do, and deals an average amount more of their damage. She also offers Unholy, where she increases the damage only undead enemies take from all champions for a lower amount. On top of being support, she's also a healer, but it's kind of the worst heal in the game. Think Donner, but it also requires you to actually get a kill before it's applied, and requires the ally to be within 2 slots of her. This can be countered a bit with her specialization choices, the first of which causing the heal to be triggered when you bring an enemy down to 50% health, but even then the heal just isn't for that much, or increasing the damage bonus of Spiritual Weapon, the clear winning choice. Her ultimate has her leap into the fray and deal a halo of radiant damage to all enemies on screen, reducing their damage by 50% and increasing the damage they take from your party by 300%, lasting 30 seconds. She's a low D, potentially even F tier champion. Her numbers are just too low to really even ever be considered, and she is in desperate need of reworking or retuning. Moving on now, we have Penelope, the chaotic good halfling druid / warlock, and the last member of the Heroes of the Plains. To start with, she gets Have You Met My Friends? Where when she attacks an enemy and doesn't kill it, she debuffs it, making them take a large amount more damage for 30 seconds. And this does count for click debuff. Penelope also gains Chewinga Mask? When the formation comes under attack, Penelope will buff the formation based on the champions around her. She'll don on her mask and call an elemental friend to give buffs which last for the entire duration you're under attack, then persisting for 10 seconds afterward. She will heal adjacent tanks with Healing Charm, and increase the damage of all champions with Tools for the Job Charm for each adjacent healing, support, or gold fine champion. Lastly, she gains Story Time, where each time a champion within 2 slots of Penelope kills an enemy, she will gain a stack of Story Time, capping at 40, and losing half when you change areas. These stacks increase the effect of her heal, and at 15 stacks adds a gold find bonus, based on a % of the damage bonus of Tools for the Job. She has 2 specialization choices. The first is a choice in how to buff Have You Met My Friends by either 60% per good champion in the formation, 40% for each evil champion, or 20% simply for each champion. This one's pretty simple, just take whichever gives you the largest bonus. But remember, she will always count as 1 and she is good. The second enhances her primary attack, which naturally slightly knocks back the closest enemy, by either making it cause a minor eruption in a small AoE, and leaving difficult terrain underneath them, slowing them. And yes, this will apply her debuff to all enemies hit. Or make the knockback 4 times as effective against non-boss enemies and increase her damage by 200%. Her ultimate causes difficult terrain in a large area underneath the nearest enemy, dealing some good damage and slowing enemies in it by 50%. She is an excellent support and debuffer, and is amazing for a click debuff formation with her slows and knockbacks. And don't forget, she's part of the Heroes of the Plains, so she has synergy with Alindra in Seat 6, specifically increasing the damage bonus of Tools for the Job for each portented champion affected by Chewinga Mask. So for ideal positioning, you want Penelope adjacent to your tanks, and adjacent to as many supports, gold finders, and healers as possible, and within 2 slots of your DPS, while having as many people affected by both Chewinga Mask and Alindra's Portent if you're using her as well. She's another one of those that rides the line between A+ and S, but considering she's so clutch for click debuff, and an honorable mention synergy with half and half for Ashara, since they both scale while the formation is under attack, I'm going to say she slides into a low S. Oh, Heroes of the Plains, you randy bastard. For the next in my complicated and lengthy to explain champions, we have Selise, the lawful neutral human paladin, serving as a tank and support. She is the last member of the Rivals of Waterdeep, and has one of the more unique ultimates in the game, which acts as a stance dance. She starts an aggressive stance, and when you activate her ult, she switches to wall stance and puts the ult on a 5-second cooldown, then deflect stance, then last resort stance, then back to aggressive. In switching from last resort to aggressive, she can Thunderous Smite, dealing Bud AoE damage to a target and 5 nearby enemies. This specific effect can only trigger once every 180 seconds, but she can keep stance dancing away while it's on cooldown. So, what are the point of the stances? Well, first of all, she has the formation ability Divine Sense, which increases the damage of champions 2 columns behind her, and is naturally increased by 100% for each Rivals of Waterdeep champion slotted in your formation. This buff gains additional benefits depending on what stance she is in. Aggressive gives champions affected reduced attack cooldown. With Wall, champions in the same column as her receive less damage from melee attacks. This is important for sub-Jimothy formations, as with a feat, Selise is Nrackable, and you can make those in her column with Wall completely immune to melee attacks, while Nrack is increasing her formation abilities. You have to be crafty to only land on melee enemies though. Deflect Stance makes champions affected take less damage from ranged and magical attacks, and Last Resort increases her Overwhelm by 15 and increases her Vow of Vengeance by 200%. So what's Vow of Vengeance? Well, while in any stance other than aggressive, Selise will increase the effect of Divine Sense even further by a fair amount for each enemy attacking her, stacking additively. Conversely, she also gains Shield of Psychomancy, where while she is in aggressive stance, she will toss her shield like Captain America in an arc every 4th attack, at the farthest enemy on screen. It stuns all enemies hit, as well as increasing the effect of Divine Sense by a fair amount for each enemy hit until she attacks with the shield again or changes stances. She has 2 separate specialization choices between 4 options. The first 3 offered are between making Wall Stance also makes Selise immune to stuns, and in turn stuns those who attempt to stun her for 4 seconds. Making Deflect Stance literally deflect projectiles back at enemies that shoot or cast them, dealing 6 seconds worth of bud damage in retaliation. Or making Last Resort Stance reduce damage taken the further her health falls below 80%. Her next selection is between whatever 2 you did not choose the first time, as well as the choice of making Divine Sense affect 3 columns behind her instead of just 2. Overall, she's a decent support and effective tank, though her numbers aren't anything crazy. I'd give her a healthy B+, and a shout out to her utility as a melee immune tank with Nrack. Now we've got Vi, the neutral good Gnome Artificer. She serves as Gold Finder, Speed, and Support. To start, she gets a Good Example, where she buffs the damage of neutral champions based on the number of good champions adjacent to the neutral champion. As long as you're able to surround your neutral DPS with good champions, it's not terrible, but it's not amazing either. For Gold Find, she has Catch and Release, which gives her a 20% chance to whip out her blunderbuss and fire at a random normal enemy, transforming them into a small glowing crystal sphere that drops additional gold when defeated, much like Jim's Mimic, but without the armor. For her speed, she gains I'm too old for this shit, where if there are only 5 or fewer enemies on screen, she will increase monster spawn speed instead of attacking. She has 2 specialization choices, the first being between allowing evil champions to also benefit from a Good Example's damage bonus, or allowing specifically Warforged champions to benefit from a Good Example, both the damage increase or the scaling factors, or just increasing the effect of a Good Example by 100%. The second choice is between either increasing the chance of whipping out her blunderbuss by 100% or increasing her sass by 100%, which is simply the means of tracking how fast the enemies spawn, with I'm Too Old. When you activate her ultimate, she summons a Metal Cockatrice that starts dealing damage to the closest enemy every second for 30 seconds. But if you press it again over that duration, it will fly into the middle of a swarm of enemies and explode, dealing large damage to all enemies caught in the explosion. She's not terrible, but not amazing either. Her speed isn't the best scaling, but it's alright. For how restrictive a Good Example is, it isn't the greatest buff. You will probably get the most out of her Catch and Release, if you can get it set up, which can be a hassle. I think she's somewhere between a B- and a C+. Lastly, we have Zorbu, the chaotic good Gnome Ranger. Yet another that has come up many times on our journey to the final seat, particularly because he is a DPS/support that is actually a good DPS. I mained him for a very long time before I transitioned into Artemis, and for good reason. His kit is fairly simple and very effective with some good scaling. First of all, he's one of those tracks a specific type of enemy, which certainly isn't my favorite mechanic, but he does it in a way that isn't insanely restrictive. With lifelong enemies, he tracks all of his kills, which persist through resets, against humanoid, beast, undead, and drow, and will deal 0.08% of the kill count more damage against each of those types. But he also increases his own damage by a higher percent of his kill count pooled together, with Seething Hatred. On top of this, he also gains Hunter's Pack, increasing the damage of himself and those adjacent to him by a decent amount if they have a dexterity score of 15 or higher. His ultimate has him send out a mechanical squirrel to a random enemy to self-destruct and deal AoE damage, and his specialization is a choice between increasing the effect of Hunter's Pack by the total bonus of Seething Hatred, increasing the effect of his lifelong enemies by 100%, or making it so when he kills an enemy it counts as 3 for tracking lifelong enemies. I'm going to be honest, I have no idea why the second one exists. Take the first if he's acting as DPS or support, and the last if you want him to farm kills. Speaking of farming kills, that's an important mechanic to Zorbu. If you want him to perform well as a DPS or support, you're going to have to take some time and farm up that lifelong enemies count. If you're a very early player, take some time and gun for at least the E4 range, and aim for E5 as you progress. And when you've got some speed going and if you really want him as your main dedicated DPS, then shoot for higher. If you are planning on using Artemis later, Zorbu is a great place to start, because as a DPS and positional buffer, Zorbu is an excellent support for Artemis as well. So any kills you farm up or any item levels you invest in him will not be wasted when you switch to Artie. Zorbu is also a great place to start if you want to learn more about debuffs and even click debuff, because as a chaotic damage dealer with a piercing primary attack, he's great to pair with a full roster of chaotic debuffers and support. His ideal formation isn't too far off what a click debuff formation would look like. Overall, he's a rock-solid A-tier champion, and for how much I used him in my playtime of this game, a very interesting champion to end my series of ranking the champions of Idle Champions in a tier list, seat by seat. I hope you've enjoyed this series, and if you have, please hit the like, subscribe, and bell notification. Leave a comment about anything you like this time around. Stay tuned because while I am done with this series, I am not done making videos about this game, nor ranking the champions of this game, as there's always more coming out, and I'm always working on the next one. Have a hell of a time out there, pterodactyls.